There was a tension in the Supreme Court hearing room so thick it felt alive. The air itself seemed to vibrate, as if every beam of oak paneling were bracing for the collision that was about to erupt. Cameras from half a dozen networks lined the back wall, their little red lights blinking, recording every breath. Justice Neil Gorsuch sat at the long mahogany table, fingers steepled, wearing the measured half-smile of a man who believed he'd already won. He was used to deference, to colleagues tiptoeing around his authority. Today, though, he wasn't facing deferential senators. Today, across from him, sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, and her eyes were locked on him like a hawk tracking prey. No one knew exactly what would happen when she took her turn at the microphone. But people were whispering, she had come with receipts. The hearing had been called to address judicial ethics and financial disclosures. A dull topic for some, but for Jasmine, it was the moment she'd been waiting for. Because while the headlines were busy with the usual noise, midterm polls, celebrity scandals, she had been digging, quietly, relentlessly. When the chairman finally called her name, Jasmine didn't rush. She adjusted the small stack of papers in front of her. She tapped her pen once, as if to check her pulse, or perhaps to steady it. Then she looked up, meeting Gorsuch's gaze head-on. "Justice Gorsuch," she began, her voice calm but edged with steel, "you've spoken often about the sanctity of the court. About how integrity matters more than perception. Is that correct?" Gorsuch inclined his head slightly. "Yes, Congresswoman. Integrity is paramount." "Good," she said, without blinking. "Then I'd like you to help me understand why you failed to disclose over $1.5 million in real estate income for nearly a decade." A hush fell so total that it seemed the entire room stopped breathing. Somewhere in the gallery, a reporter's pen slipped from their hand and clattered to the floor. Gorsuch didn't answer at once. He reached for his water glass, but Jasmine spoke again before he could find his composure. "I'm not here to be polite," she said evenly. "I'm here because the American people deserve transparency. You preach about ethics while signing decisions that impact millions, but you can't manage a basic disclosure form?" A tremor passed through the room, raw, electric. Gorsuch cleared his throat, voice tight. "With respect, Congresswoman, you're mischaracterizing the nature of those transactions." Jasmine didn't look away. "No, Justice. What I'm doing is reading your own filings. And I'm wondering why you think you can silence accountability by hiding behind your robe." It was the first time anyone had ever spoken to him like that in a public hearing. And even before he opened his mouth to fire back, the audience could feel it, something historic was beginning. Gorsuch's jaw flexed as he tried to recapture the advantage. His voice was low, designed to sound patient, but a thin edge of irritation leaked through. "Congresswoman Crockett, you are oversimplifying complex legal and financial matters. If you'd allow me to explain." Jasmine leaned in, elbows on the table, not giving an inch. "I'm not here for your lecture on complexity, Justice. Ordinary Americans fill out disclosure forms every year without a battalion of clerks to hold their hands." A nervous chuckle rippled from the press row, then died as quickly as it began. The camera zoomed in, catching the faint flush creeping up Gorsuch's neck. She picked up a document and held it aloft so the crowd could see. "This is a property transfer agreement bearing your signature, dated 3 years after you claim the assets were divested. Do you dispute this record?" He hesitated. A flicker of calculation crossed his face, like a man searching for a lever to yank the room back under his control. "I do not recall the specifics of that filing," he began. Jasmine's tone stayed eerily calm. "Interesting. Because the woman who sold you the property remembers you quite well. She described in detail how you assured her it would remain confidential." Gorsuch's eyes narrowed. "That's hearsay." "It's testimony," Jasmine interrupted, her voice steady. "And I'm submitting it to the record. Along with notarized documents you neglected to disclose." He shifted in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. For the first time, the unshakable mask of Supreme Court detachment began to crack. A staffer behind Jasmine handed her another folder. She didn't look down, her focus was locked on Gorsuch's face. "Here's what I think," she said, her words landing like a gavel strike. "I think you believe you're above scrutiny because you wear that robe. I think you expect this committee to bow to you because you've grown accustomed to being untouchable." The hush in the room grew denser, thick as wet cement. "But you don't intimidate me," she continued. "And you don't get to silence the people I represent. Not today." Gorsuch tried to answer, but she raised her hand, palm up, stopping him cold. "This isn't your courtroom," Jasmine said. "This is ours. And you will answer for every line of every document you tried to bury." A low gasp echoed through the chamber. Even the chairman looked stunned. And on the feeds broadcasting nationwide, millions of viewers leaned forward, captivated by the sight of the unflappable Justice Gorsuch visibly rattled for the first time in his career. The cameras didn't dare blink. The entire chamber seemed locked in suspended animation, as if the oxygen had been drained and replaced with something volatile. Gorsuch's lips parted, but whatever he'd planned to say came out sounding brittle. "Congresswoman Crockett, with all due respect, this hearing is not a trial. You are grandstanding for the cameras." Jasmine tilted her head, studying him as if she were examining a cracked statue. Her voice dropped lower, so low that everyone had to lean in to catch it. "Do you know what real grandstanding looks like?" she asked softly. "It looks like issuing sweeping decisions that strip rights away from millions of women, then boarding a private plane paid for by your donors." A rustle of shock swept the gallery. Several aides glanced at each other, eyes wide. Even the stenographer hesitated, glancing up to confirm she'd heard correctly before resuming her rapid typing. Gorsuch drew a slow breath. "Those are unsubstantiated allegations." "No," Jasmine said, lifting her finger to point directly at him. "Those are facts. And I didn't come here with opinions. I came here with receipts." She reached into her folder again, extracting a thick sheaf of documents stamped with official seals. Her hands didn't tremble. "This," she continued, holding up a packet, "is a timeline of your contacts with known political megadonors whose cases were pending before the court. It includes emails, flight records, and a memo where your staff discussed how to keep it off the public docket." She laid the papers down deliberately, one by one, like a dealer turning over a winning hand. "Would you like to deny these records?" she asked. Gorsuch swallowed, eyes darting across the crowd, searching for an ally, a friendly face, any refuge. "I will not engage in this spectacle," he said tightly. Jasmine didn't smile. "You already have. When you decided your power was more important than your duty." Silence again, only deeper this time. The kind that settles in your bones. Someone in the back, an older man in a gray suit, stood up abruptly, as if he needed air. Reporters' thumbs danced frantically across their phones, live-tweeting every syllable. And still, Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her composure was more devastating than any outrage could have been. She tapped the last document with her pen. "If you won't answer here, you will answer when this committee moves to subpoena every last record you thought you could keep hidden." The crowd was transfixed. On millions of screens across America, people leaned closer, because in that moment, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just confronting a Supreme Court justice. She was tearing a hole in the myth of untouchability he'd wrapped around himself. Gorsuch exhaled, the sound ragged around the edges. For a heartbeat, it looked as if he might stand up and leave the table altogether, like a man realizing too late he'd wandered onto terrain he couldn't control. But Jasmine didn't give him that out. She held his gaze with the quiet steadiness of someone who'd been underestimated her entire life, and learned to use it like a blade. "Justice Gorsuch," she said, her voice cool as glass, "do you remember what you wrote in the majority opinion for Dobbs?" He didn't answer. She didn't need him to. You wrote that the court must return the question of rights to the people's elected representatives. She tapped her pen against her binder. So here I am, an elected representative, asking you why the rights of ordinary citizens should be subjected to scrutiny you've never applied to yourself. A shiver passed through the gallery, an audible ripple of unease and awe. Gorsuch tried to pivot, his tone tightening. Congresswoman, judicial independence is foundational to our republic. What you're suggesting? I'm suggesting accountability, Jasmine interrupted, her tone as measured as it was merciless. I'm suggesting that if a judge can sign secret agreements with billionaires and fly off to luxury retreats while lecturing Americans about sacrifice, then the republic has already been compromised. The hush turned electric. Every eye was on her, from the youngest congressional aides to the most jaded reporters. She leaned back slightly in her chair, but her intensity never dimmed. You call this a spectacle, she said. But the real spectacle is that you thought no one would ever question you. That you assumed your title was a shield. Gorsuch's mouth pressed into a hard line. This is beneath the dignity of. No, Jasmine said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. What's beneath dignity is betraying public trust and calling it jurisprudence. He fell silent. She opened the last folder, revealing a single, glossy photograph, an aerial shot of a private compound where Gorsuch had spent a long weekend after the Dobbs decision. Paid for by donors who also fund legal campaigns to strip reproductive rights, she said flatly. If you think the American people can't connect those dots, you haven't been paying attention. A sound filled the chamber, a collective intake of breath, the moment people realized they're witnessing history. Jasmine looked down the table, then back at him, her expression calm and implacable. You don't have to answer me today, she said softly. But you will answer. Because this isn't your courtroom anymore. It's the people's. Reporters erupted, cameras flashing like a summer lightning storm. And in millions of homes across the country, viewers sat stunned, watching the unthinkable unfold in real time. For a long moment, no one seemed to remember how to breathe. Even Gorsuch, who had built his entire reputation on composure and intellectual detachment, looked momentarily unmoored, like a man discovering the ocean floor was 1,000 feet deeper than he'd thought. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't raise her chin in triumph. She simply let the weight of the evidence settle into the air, heavy as a storm cloud. A reporter near the aisle whispered, she just did what nobody's dared. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She drew in a deliberate breath and spoke again, her voice lower now, more intimate, like she was speaking to everyone watching at home. I want every person sitting in their living room tonight, every mother who's been told she doesn't have a right to decide over her body, every worker who's been told the system is fair while billionaires write the rules behind closed doors, to understand one thing, she said, her tone clear as a bell. This is not about partisanship. It's about power. It's about the arrogance of a few who believe they can never be questioned. Her eyes flicked to Gorsuch's, unwavering. And I am here to tell you, Justice, that era is over. He started to respond, some rehearsed line about institutional integrity, but the words didn't come. Because no matter how polished the script, nothing he could say would erase the sight of those receipts stacked on the table in front of him. Jasmine slowly closed her binder and folded her hands. If you have an explanation, she said, we're all listening. But he didn't. The silence stretched so long that the chairman finally cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the hearing. Congresswoman Crockett, your time has expired, he said, his voice hushed as if even he was reluctant to puncture the moment. Jasmine nodded once. Then I'll yield, she said. She didn't look victorious. She looked resolute, like a woman who understood that the fight was far from over but had just torn a crack in a wall that had stood untouched for decades. In the gallery, a woman wiped tears from her eyes. In the press pen, a young reporter mouthed, "Wow," to no one in particular. And across America, millions of people who'd long since given up believing that anyone in power would ever be held accountable, felt something they hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Outside the hearing room, the air was thick with the low buzz of journalists on their phones, calling in what they knew would be the story of the week, maybe the year. And inside, Gorsuch's aides clustered at the far end of the table, their expressions fixed in that peculiar blend of dread and calculation that always appears when power starts to slip. Jasmine watched them for a moment, then glanced toward the committee chairman. He looked almost relieved to have the cameras focused on someone else. She could have stood up then and walked out triumphant, but she didn't. Instead, she leaned into the mic one last time, her voice softer, as if speaking past the justices and directly to the country itself. "You know," she began, her tone threaded with something that sounded almost like sadness, "there was a time when I believed the Supreme Court was the final word. That no matter how bitter or divided we became as a nation, this institution was above it all, objective, principled, unassailable." Her gaze moved back to Gorsuch, whose jaw flexed but who still said nothing. "But then I started looking closer. And I saw the same sickness here that I've seen everywhere else, unearned privilege masquerading as merit. Wealth laundering its agenda through the language of law." The words fell like stones in water, no flourish, no drama, just undeniable gravity. "I don't say this because I hate the court," she continued. "I say this because I love what it could be. What it should be. And I am tired, of watching ordinary Americans pay the price for a system that protects the powerful and punishes the vulnerable." Someone in the gallery clapped, a single, sharp sound quickly smothered by protocol. But Jasmine didn't react. She was already gathering her papers, calm and deliberate, as though she'd merely finished a routine cross-examination. Gorsuch finally spoke, his voice low and brittle. "Congresswoman Crockett, you may disagree with this institution, but I assure you, your accusations." She turned to look at him, and in that glance was the quiet certainty that she didn't need to say another word. She had already said everything that mattered. And the country had heard it. As she rose from her seat, every camera pivoted to follow her. In living rooms and offices, in break rooms and airports, people were glued to their screens, replaying the moment she'd laid bare what so many had suspected and so few had dared to say. Outside the chamber doors, a staffer tried to offer Jasmine a folder she'd left behind. She shook her head, voice clear but gentle. "No, thank you," she said. "That chapter's closed." But everyone watching knew the Rayal story was only beginning. As Jasmine walked down the marble hallway, her heels striking the floor in measured, echoing beats, she felt the press closing in behind her, reporters practically tripping over each other to get close. "Congresswoman Crockett," someone shouted. "Do you have a statement about Justice Gorsuch's silence?" She didn't break stride. For once, she didn't feel the urge to fill the vacuum with words. The silence was the statement. But halfway down the corridor, she paused. Slowly, she turned back to face the cameras, the cluster of correspondents, the gawking staffers who couldn't believe what they'd just witnessed. Her voice was calm. "I'll say this," she began. "This wasn't about humiliating a Supreme Court justice. It wasn't about scoring a clip for social media. It was about accountability." A murmur rippled through the reporters as they leaned in. "It's about reminding every person who has ever felt invisible, every worker, every mother, every kid who doesn't have the right last name or the right zip code, that no title, no robe, no bank account makes you untouchable," Jasmine said, her tone never rising above measured certainty. A flashbulb went off. Somewhere behind the scrum, a woman whispered, "She's not afraid of them." Jasmine held the reporter's gaze. "This hearing was one step," she continued. "But I promise you, it won't be the last." Someone asked, "What do you say to critics who claim you crossed a line?" She didn't hesitate. "Sometimes you have to cross a line to show people it was never meant to be there." Her eyes lifted past the cameras to the tall doors of the chamber she'd just exited. For the briefest instant, she thought of all the times she'd been told to wait her turn, to be deferential, to trust the process. She thought about how little that advice had ever protected the people she fought for. Then she turned away, her expression steady. The press scrambled to keep up, but she was already moving again, past the portraits of men who'd never been questioned, down the corridor lined with the silent records of power. And behind her, in that vast chamber of authority, the echo of her voice, clear, unsparing, unafraid, still hadn't faded. Hours later, the footage of the hearing was everywhere. It looped across cable news banners and news feeds, dissected in real time by panels who couldn't decide whether Jasmine was a hero or a menace. On one network, a commentator in a navy suit shook his head. She was out of line, he insisted, voice tight with indignation. There are traditions. Boundaries. His co-host looked at him like he'd missed the point entirely. Or maybe, she replied, she was the first one willing to say the obvious out loud. That was the split, two Americas watching the same clip and seeing completely different things. But in living rooms and break rooms, in barbershops and school cafeterias, the reaction was simpler, more visceral. A teacher in Detroit turned to her teenage daughter and said, "That's what it looks like when you refuse to be small." An older man in Tulsa murmured, "They didn't expect her to come with receipts." And a college student in Atlanta posted a single line under the viral video, "I've never seen them look that scared." Jasmine didn't bother watching the broadcasts. She knew how they'd frame it. The outrage would burn hot, then fade. But the truth? The truth had staying power. Late that night, she sat alone in her office, the skyline of D.C. stretched out behind her. She still hadn't taken off her jacket. Her phone was full of missed calls, some congratulatory, some demanding an apology. But she wasn't thinking about any of them. She was thinking about the young staffer she'd passed in the hall after the hearing, wide-eyed, voice shaking as she said, "I didn't know you could do that." Jasmine had smiled gently. "You can," she'd told her. "You just have to decide you're done being afraid." In the quiet, she picked up her pen and began drafting the next resolution, one aimed squarely at the conflicts of interest no one wanted to touch. The cameras would be ready. The headlines would write themselves. And she would walk right back into that chamber without a single apology for the noise she was about to make. Because sometimes, shaking the institution was the only way to remind it whom it was supposed to serve. By morning, the hearing had already settled into the bloodstream of the internet. The clip of Jasmine's voice, steady, unflinching, had racked up millions of views, reposted by people who couldn't remember the last time a congressional moment felt this raw. In newsrooms across the country, editors scrambled to rework headlines. She didn't flinch. She didn't bow. She just told the truth. And all the while, Justice Gorsuch remained silent. No statement. No defense. Just a single, anodyne press release from the court's communications office insisting the judiciary had great respect for all perspectives. It was exactly the sort of bloodless language Jasmine had come to expect from the institutions she challenged. But for ordinary people watching, the contrast was impossible to ignore: Gorsuch's studied quiet, Jasmine's blunt honesty. Mid-morning, she walked into her district office in Dallas to find the phones ringing non-stop. Some calls were from supporters. Others were furious. But more than anything, they were curious, hungry to know what came next. Her staffer Devin looked up from his laptop, eyes wide. "They're saying this is going to define your career," he said. Jasmine shrugged out of her coat, her expression calm. "Then I guess it'll be defined by telling the truth." Devin hesitated. "Are you worried about the backlash?" She paused, then answered with the same quiet certainty that had frozen the courtroom. "No," she said. "I'm worried about what happens if nobody says it." She didn't say it to grandstand. She said it because she meant it. In a corner of the office, the television played muted coverage. A legal analyst was reading from prepared notes, listing the ways Jasmine's remarks had breached decorum. Jasmine didn't even glance at the screen. She knew decorum had always been the armor of the comfortable. She picked up her notes, reviewed the draft of the next committee hearing. She'd already decided she would not moderate her tone. She would not smooth the edges to make her warnings easier to swallow. Because if the cost of telling the truth was being called disruptive, she'd pay it 100 times over. That evening, when the headlines had finally begun to soften and the cable panels drifted on to other scandals, Jasmine slipped out of the office and walked alone through the quiet streets. No cameras. No aides. Just her breath, her thoughts, and the old brick facades glowing under the streetlights. She thought about the thousands of people who'd watched that hearing and recognized something in her voice, something they'd been waiting to hear from someone in power. She also thought about the ones who would keep insisting she'd gone too far, been too blunt, made too many waves. But as she paused beneath an iron street lamp, she knew this much for certain: there was no such thing as too far when you were fighting to make sure power didn't get to hide behind its own privilege. Her phone buzzed with another flood of messages. She ignored them. She didn't need more validation. She needed more action. She remembered what an older activist had once told her in a church basement long before she ever ran for office. The system won't fix itself. You have to show up ready to fight, and ready to outlast. That night, standing alone in the city that had taught her so much about power and its illusions, she promised herself she would do exactly that. No matter how many headlines tried to soften the story. No matter how many pundits tried to reframe it. She'd keep showing up. She'd keep telling the truth. And she'd keep reminding the highest court in the land, and every institution that believed itself untouchable, that accountability wasn't a courtesy. It was a requirement. And she wasn't done. Not even close.